Director Christopher Wray, and we'll begin with Senator Coons.
Thank you, Senator Sass. Thank you, future Chairman Sass, for the opportunity to question the witness. And Mr. Wray, thank you for your prior service and your continued willingness to serve our country, particularly at this important and difficult time. And I know this may not need repeating, but let us not forget why we're having this hearing. Your predecessor, James Comey, was not even at the halfway point of his 10-year term as FBI director when President Trump abruptly fired him without cause and without warning. And President Trump said when he fired Director Comey that he was thinking about the FBI's investigation of Russian interference into our elections, an investigation that Director Comey was then overseeing. So now, more than ever, I believe it to be crucial that our next FBI director be prepared to be steadfastly independent. And as we had a chance to discuss before this hearing, it falls on you today not only to clearly demonstrate to our committee that you possess the legal, investigative, and management skills required for the position for which you've been nominated, but that you have a fierce commitment to maintaining the integrity of the FBI as an independent agency, and that you will conduct yourself as FBI director in a way that is above partisanship. So let's move to it if we might. First, how will you ensure that the FBI provides all the resources that Special Counsel Mueller needs to thoroughly conduct and complete the investigation he's currently in charge of?
Well, Senator, the first thing I would do, if confirmed, is to reach out to former Director Mueller and elicit his advice about what it is he needs and whether he's getting it from the FBI. And knowing former Director Mueller and knowing what a straight talker and plain talker he is, I have no doubt that if he's not getting what he needs, he would let me know.
I agree. Attorney General Sessions praised your selection as the FBI nominee. Did you interview with Attorney General Sessions?
I interviewed with Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein and Attorney General Sessions together at the same time.
And did either of them ask you about the conduct of the Russia investigation during your interview?
No.
Attorney General Sessions, as we've discussed and you well know, is recused from, and I quote, any existing or future investigations of any matters related in any way to the campaigns for President of the United States, including the investigation into Russian interference. As I told you when we met before, I'm concerned that Attorney General Sessions hasn't fully complied with the scope of his recusal. Is it appropriate for the Attorney General to make public comments on the ongoing investigation, to engage in decisions about its resourcing, funding, or staffing? Is that an appropriate part of his management role of the agency as Attorney General?
Well, Senator, I'm not sure it's for me to speak to the Attorney General's decision-making about his own public comments. I would say that if he's recused from an investigation, to me that means he shouldn't be participating in decision-making about the investigation. But of course the Attorney General is the head of the entire Justice Department, and there's, as important as this particular investigation is, and it is extremely important in my view, there are many, many, many other things that the FBI and the department are responsible for, and I think that is the appropriate role for the Attorney General as its leader.
So I'll agree with you that, in my view, it's not appropriate for the Attorney General to participate in investigations related to the Trump campaign. And as the person in charge of the operations of the Department of Justice, he is involved in making at the highest level management decisions. But it's exactly those decisions about the access to resources, the scope, the trajectory of Bob Mueller's investigation that I wanted to make sure I got to. Will you commit to studying the scope of Attorney General Sessions' recusal and ensuring appropriate procedures are in place to honor it at the FBI, and then reporting any violations of that recusal to this Congress?
Well, Senator, I'm not sure I'm the authority over his recusal scope. What I would commit to you is that I will take a close look shortly upon being confirmed, if confirmed, to, as I said, making sure that former Director Mueller, now Special Counsel Mueller, has all the appropriate resources that he ought to have. And my expectation is that I would remain committed to that support regardless of any decisions by anybody else in the department.
So if a directive came down from the Attorney General about prioritization or resources that you thought inappropriately interfered or interfered in any way with the resources requested by Special Counsel Mueller, you'd act to prevent that from hindering the investigation?
I would not tolerate any inappropriate influence on Special Counsel Mueller's investigation to the extent that I'm supporting it. At the end of the day, it's his investigation.
We had another conversation last week, it's been raised by other colleagues, about an episode during your time at the Department of Justice when you were prepared to resign. And this was over an ongoing, but unauthorized by Congress, surveillance program. And you testified previously you hadn't been read into all the details of it. And it seemed in some ways you were going on a gut hunch. You were following people who you knew were thoroughly read in, who you'd practiced closely with and whom you admired. I'm just characterizing roughly what I heard before. But now in hindsight, you've had time to better understand what was going on, what was the contest and what were the issues. In hindsight, were you right to be willing to throw your career aside and to be willing to join these folks in resigning had they had to? And would you do that again?
As to the first part of your question, Senator, I have not for any minute ever regretted my willingness to resign as I explained it to Deputy Attorney General Comey at that time. My decision was not based solely on gut. My decision was based on knowledge, very close working knowledge with the range of people who were read in, and knowing that they were not, as I said to Senator Whitehouse, not shrinking violets, very tough on terror, very thoughtful, intellectually honest people, and people who, by the way, didn't all agree with each other all the time. So when I put all that together, my familiarity with those people, how they think, how they come out on war on terror issues, and knowing that they felt strongly enough that they were willing to resign over much greater knowledge of the program than I had at the time, I was confident then that resigning with them, if necessary, was the right decision. And now later, having learned many more of the facts that weren't available to me then, I'm even more confident that it would have been the right decision.
Thank you for that. Former Attorney General Bell, I think you quoted before, as saying that you should be willing to resign if necessary over conduct if you're pressed to engage in it that's either unethical, illegal, or unconstitutional. Could you just explore for me for a few more minutes what were the values that you brought to that decision, and what values among those three or others would you bring to having to make a similar decision in the future if you get pressed to do something that meets one of those three tests suggested by former Attorney General Bell?
Well, the values I brought to that particular decision were the knowledge that it was the appropriate parts of the Justice Department and the FBI were doing their job, doing their duty to evaluate the legality of the program in question. And I thought that, knowing the confidence that I had in them, in their commitment to duty, their ability to do their job, that needed to be respected even to the point of me having to resign to support them in it. I'm not sure if I got all of your questions, so I might need you to refresh me.
That's more than satisfactory, thank you. Acting Attorney General Sally Yates was fired after she refused to defend the travel ban based on her concerns the order wasn't lawful or consistent with the facts. If you were fired or resign for refusing to carry out a presidential order, will you commit to come to Congress to testify about that decision and what drove you to make that decision?
Well, certainly if I legally and appropriately can. I mean, I'd need to know the circumstances of any particular situation, but I would want to comply with the law and the rules first and foremost. But if I can, I would comply with any lawful request from Congress.
Let me, if I now, in my last minute, return to a question that was raised earlier. I just want to make sure we've gotten this clearly. Senator Graham asked you about an email to Donald Trump Jr. Offering the Trump campaign very high-level and sensitive information, and this is a quote from the email, as part of Russia and its government support for Mr. Trump. Chief ethics lawyers for former presidents George W. Bush and President Obama have said, and this is a joint quote, "We've worked on political campaigns for decades and have never heard of an offer like this one. If we had, we would have insisted upon immediate notification of the FBI and so would any normal campaign lawyer, official, or even senior volunteer. Russian interference in our election happened and may very well happen again. If a campaign staffer or a senator or someone working around them gets an offer of foreign government assistance to defeat its opponent, do you agree the right thing to do is to promptly notify the FBI?
Senator, I would hope that anyone who is aware of an effort to, or an attempt to interfere with our elections would report that to the appropriate authorities. I mean, just whether it's somebody in a campaign or somebody anywhere else. I think especially in the context of cyber type intrusions, the FBI and others in the intelligence community depend on people who are receiving the contact from reaching out and coordinating with law enforcement intelligence community. And that's a big, important part of the messaging on that effort. And so I would think anybody in that situation, I would hope, would want to bring the issue to the attention of the appropriate authorities, assuming they think that something untoward or inappropriate has occurred.
Can you reach any other conclusion from that email other than something untoward and inappropriate is being proffered?
Senator, I haven't read the email. I haven't even had a chance to read any of the newspaper coverage. It's all happened during a time when I've spent all day going from one Senate building to another, meeting with all of your colleagues, and so I'm sorry, but I just don't know the details of the email.
I think Senator Graham's already asked for you to get ready on it and respond to us in the future. Do I have a few more minutes, or Senator Sass, do you have another round of questions? I understand we're waiting for Senator Flake, who may be on as well.
Another round, but we also have votes, so you can go 2 more, but not a full round. 2 more minutes.
I will conclude.
Thank you, sir.
Let me simply say to your family, I'm grateful for your willingness to undertake this. And to you personally, I'm grateful for your willingness to undertake this. As we spoke, I think we are at an absolutely essential moment for the future of rule of law and respect for our institutions and traditions in this country. And as you've heard from senators, both Republican and Democrat, this is an essential confirmation hearing and a critical role which you're undertaking because of the pace at which things are moving, because of the challenges and issues and allegations in front of us, because of the central role the FBI plays in counterintelligence, in enforcing our laws, in protecting our republic. And I am confident that you have the skills, the experience, and the values to be a great FBI director. I appreciate your testimony in front of this committee today.
Thank you, Senator. It means a lot.
I'd like to associate myself with those comments from the senator from Delaware as well. I think this is a critically important time in public life and for not just the rule of law, but also the norms around it. And I appreciate the thoughts and sentiments from the Delaware senator. I'd like to return to something you said in your opening statement, and I'm quoting you. While the FBI has justly earned its reputation as the finest law enforcement agency in the world, its special agents, analysts, and staff operate largely out of public view. They toil at great risk to themselves and at great sacrifice by their families. But they happily defer individual recognition because they believe that the principles they serve are so much larger than themselves. It's beautifully crafted, and as someone who's worked with and around the Bureau before, 36,000 current employees of the Bureau, is that right?
I think it's about that.
Some really thoughtful, selfless public servants who do toil, often at great financial cost compared to what they could earn in the private sector, without a lot of recognition, oftentimes in danger and at threats of life and limb and time away from home. And thank you for representing them in the way you talk about the mission and the culture of the Bureau. Obviously, there have been some dark times at the Bureau in the past. We've spoken a little bit today about Director Hoover and the ways that he mismanaged that agency 45, 50 years ago. But also, there was politicization of the Bureau by White Houses and administrations across both parties. The Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, and the Nixon administration all regularly tried to politicize and weaponize the FBI against civil rights activists and against lots of other people who weren't able to fight back against that big and overreaching state. And I think one of the reasons why you've heard so much support for the way you conceive of this mission and this calling today is because of the ways you've made clear how you think this calling and this oath obligate you to work for the Constitution, in defense of the Constitution on behalf of the American people, not on behalf of either political party. And as you've reiterated again and again, your willingness to resign if ever forced to politicize an investigation. And I think that's why you hear so much bipartisan support for your confirmation today. Would you also pledge to this committee that if ever directed by the White House to shut down or curtail an investigation, that you would report that back to this committee? Not necessarily in a public setting, but at the very least in a classified setting. Will you commit today that any White House direction that you would curtail or end an investigation is something that you would report back to this committee and the Senate?
Well, I would certainly report it wherever it is appropriate. I would need to make sure that I was compliant with all my legal obligations in doing so, but if I can appropriately do it, I would want to make sure that I could bring it to the appropriate committee's attention in the appropriate way.
And I appreciate all of the complicated chain of command issues inside an agency like yours and Main Justice, where the Bureau reports in a little more at the DAG level than at the AG level. I recognize that that's complicated, but wouldn't you also agree with us that the Senate's constitutional obligations to oversight mean that we are one of the destinations to which you should be reporting, not just the executive department's chain of command?
Well, I would certainly agree that this committee and other committees with oversight responsibility over the FBI have an enormously critical role. It's part of our system, and I think it needs to be respected in all the appropriate ways. And I would make every effort within the chain of command that you referred to, Senator, to urge that we be as forthcoming as we legally and appropriately can be with all the right members of the Senate and the House.
This is obviously a very politicized time in American life and a politicized time in the Congress, but I'm filling in right now for a chairman, Chuck Grassley of Iowa, who has lots of bipartisan respect around this place because people know that when he does oversight, he's doing it as an Article I branch of Article II of the Constitution. He's not doing it as a Republican of an administration that he's either is or isn't aligned with his own party affiliation. This is a constitutional separation of powers issue. And so I think I can probably say on behalf of the chairman that there's a lot of robust support around here for you making sure that you recognize that this is a committee that would like to hear those details when you are ever pushed to politicize. Your predecessor, assuming your confirmation, famously referred to WikiLeaks as intelligence porn as opposed to journalism. And he said that the bedrock of our democracy requires public trust, and that WikiLeaks is regularly acting on behalf of other governments against the interests of the U.S. public. Can you briefly explain for this committee and the American people how you believe that WikiLeaks came to be an outlet of foreign and specifically Russian propaganda?
Senator, I don't have access to that information, so I don't know how that came to occur. I certainly share former Director Comey's concern about that. And I have no reason to doubt his description, but that's something that I would have to learn more about once I had access, once again, to classified information. But WikiLeaks was not a thing when I was in government before, so my observations of it have been solely through, like any American, watching the news media in bits and pieces.
I recognize that you've been in the private sector, so you're not up to speed on all of these issues yet, but is it your sense as you're arriving to lead a critical agency that is a part of the intelligence community? It's a broadly law enforcement agency, but obviously has the National Security Division, and you have lots of other IC relationships. Is it your view that we are currently adequately investing in the cyber challenges of our time?
Well, Senator, I don't think I know enough to be able to make a really responsible evaluation of the resources. What I can tell you is that my sense is that as much as everybody is talking about the threats of the sort that you're describing, I have the sense that we are just scratching the surface of how grave the threats really are, or at least how grave the threats are about to be before we blink and wake up. Now, that's really based on just what limited information conversations I've had with people. But my sense is that one of the biggest changes I've seen from being in law enforcement for a number of years and then being out and now starting to get reintroduced again is whereas cyber was a sort of discrete topic back in, say, 2005 that had a lot of attention, now in 2017, cyber in many ways permeates every aspect of national security, the intelligence community, of every type of criminal conduct we deal with. It's become part of the fabric, both of our security, but also of the threats to our security. And it's hard for me to imagine that we're doing nearly enough. I think we can always do better.
When you are in the SCIF, when you're in a classified bunker getting briefings on these topics, I'm one of 5 people in the U.S. Senate who's never been a politician before. So I've been here for about 30 months, and in my time interviewing people, it is fairly stunning how when you ask direct questions about not just our cyber operations and our implementation, but cyber doctrine, offensive and defensive doctrine, when you ask who's responsible for cyber doctrine inside the executive branch, in the last administration and in the current administration, the main thing that happens is people start looking sideways and trying to figure out who else they can point to. How do you conceive of the FBI's responsibilities in the larger institutional framework of cyber responsibilities across the U.S. government? What is the FBI's role?
Well, I think the FBI probably has multiple roles. It has a criminal investigative role when there are ways in which the criminal investigative tools can be used to prevent, detect, disrupt threats. But then it also has an intelligence role where it partners with our partners in the intelligence community and our overseas partners in trying to defend our systems and our infrastructure from attacks, which is a slightly different kind of role. And the two things work hand in hand. And I would think that there's an analogy that could be drawn to the terrorism arena in terms of awareness. I remember listening to a prominent counterterrorism expert in a room full of prosecutors from all around the world. And it was a very jovial meeting until this guy got up and spoke. And he said, there are 2 types of countries. There are those who've been hit by a terrorist attack and get it. And there are those who have not yet. And then you could have heard a pin drop, because it certainly cut a lot of the joy out of the room. And I think there is a degree to which the cyber threats that we face, the same kind of statement could be made there. My strong suspicion is that there are countries that have been hit and have started to wake up. There are companies that have been hit and have started to wake up. And then there are many who haven't realized it yet. Keyword being yet, because it's coming.
Assuming that you're confirmed, can you tell us a little bit about your first 90 days or first 100-day plan for how you will assess issues like our cyber capabilities and our cyber threats, and obviously in the counterterrorism space, a place that you've worked a lot more, trying to get back up to speed with where we may be underinvesting and how you risk rank and prioritize among those? What's your arrival plan?
Well, I think one of the first things I need to do is sit down with the senior management of the Bureau and start getting briefed up on all of the areas that the FBI is responsible for. I would be largely following off of the priorities that the FBI has in its strategy, which prioritizes counterterrorism, counterespionage, and cyber at the top. But since my guess is I'm probably furthest behind in some ways just because of the advance in technology on the cyber front, I would want to prioritize, in particular, spending more time on some of those issues early on, just because my own learning curve, as is true of anybody who's been out of that part of it, with the breakneck pace and advance in technology, would be impacted. So those would be some of the things I would prioritize early on.
Thank you. I have a number of cyber questions that you and I started discussing in my office that I look forward to following up with you on and trying to support you on when you have this important new calling. I'm going to turn the gavel back to the chairman, but if Senator Flake is ready to go, we will turn the questioning over to him. Thank you, Mr. Ray.
Thank you for being here, and thanks for the visit to my office as well. Enjoyed the discussion. And just following up on some of that, I know these questions have been asked. a lot of times already, but the obligatory, do you feel that you can exhibit independence there as director of the FBI that's necessary for that position?
Senator, I am my own man, and I intend to be governed by the Constitution, by the laws, and by the rules, and to do things by the book, strictly independently, without fear or favor, and certainly without regard to partisan politics. That's the only way I think you can do this job.
Thank you. We discussed in my office some of the challenges coming up for the FBI. You mentioned technology and cyber, obviously. But with regard to technology, it seems that, in this committee, we try to balance, obviously, security and privacy. As soon as we arrive at a solution, technology changes, and we're at square one once again. Can you talk about that process with the FBI and how you can work with this committee and the Congress to ensure that we have the proper balance between privacy and security?
Well, certainly, as you say, Senator, there needs to be a balance, and that's not just a privacy interest, but a protection of infrastructure. But I do believe very strongly that technology, the private sector, is advancing at such a rapid pace, and government historically, federal government, state and local government, foreign governments, are historically not as nimble in change. And somehow we as a country have to figure out a way to get to be one step ahead of the bad guys and those who would do us harm, and the way they would use technology against us, as opposed to constantly chasing the last technological advance. And so I think it's got to be a high priority to work both with the Congress, but also to reach out to industry and see if we can secure better cooperation in that effort.
Right. Thank you. Turning to an issue that's important to Arizona as a border state, eliminating public corruption on the southern border has traditionally been a priority for the FBI. And in the past, the Bureau has investigated public corruption and identified key trends in the type and frequency of these activities. Do you agree that this remains an issue, especially for border states like Arizona?
Well, Senator, I strongly agree that public corruption is an important priority for the FBI all throughout the country. My experience with public corruption investigations goes all the way back to my time as a law prosecutor, and some of the most meaningful cases that I worked on were public corruption cases. And then as Assistant Attorney General, of course, the Public Integrity Section reported up to me, and that section played an incredibly important role. As to the FBI, my experience historically has been that some of the very, very best agents in the FBI gravitate to the public corruption squads, and that's because the skill level and sophistication of the very best FBI agents is, in my view, without parallel. And public corruption cases are extremely difficult to pursue, and it requires some of the best and brightest agents, and it's watching a good public corruption FBI agent work a public corruption case is really a sight to behold, and it would inspire any American as it did me when I saw it.
All right. Thank you. As you may or may not know, all applicants for law enforcement positions at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, are congressionally mandated to pass a polygraph test as a condition of employment. The problem that we're having is that CBP experiences significantly higher failure rates, around 65%, than any other federal law enforcement agency. These high failure rates have prevented CBP from hiring enough officers to adequately staff our ports of entry, for example. And I think it's problematic for CBP to be turning away qualified applicants with distinguished military and law enforcement service records just because of a potentially flawed polygraph. What we're finding is a lot of people are reluctant to submit themselves because they've heard of false positives out there and fear that it might impact their ability to land another federal or state or local law enforcement job in the future. Given FBI's success administering its own polygraph, and I've asked this of Mr. Comey as well, will you commit to provide guidance or share best practices with CBP and DHS to better conduct their polygraph examination?
Well, Senator, that's not an issue that I'm especially familiar with at this stage, but something I would look forward to learning more about and seeing how we at the Bureau could be helpful to CBP in that regard.
That would be helpful. FBI, we understand, has a much better program there, and it is a significant problem on our border to hire just to deal with attrition, let alone hire the number of officers as Border Patrol agents or port officials that we need. Now, over the past few years, we've witnessed several high-profile data breaches at federal government agencies, including OMB. Data breaches are often caused by a technological vulnerability or human vulnerability, or both. I asked your predecessor about this, but I want to hear your thoughts as well. Given the amount of sensitive data held by the FBI and DOJ generally, what steps will you take at the Bureau to ensure that its data is secure, both from technological weaknesses and by human hackers?
Well, Senator, at the moment, I don't know much about the FBI's security status in terms of its cybersecurity, but that's something I would need to focus on early on. I'd want to get briefed by the right experts to understand not only what we've done, but what they see as the threats, and how they can be confident that they've correctly identified the threats. What kind of pressure testing and reality checking they've done to make sure that our systems aren't more vulnerable than they might appreciate.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hirono.
Yeah, I'd like to defer to my colleague, Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you. Thanks to Senator Hirono for permitting me to go first. Good afternoon, Mr. Wray. Thank you for your willingness to serve and your families. I want to ask you a couple of questions and hope that you can give me answers that are as straightforward as you can, given the limitations of your position. In your view, is obstruction of justice a serious crime?
Absolutely.
Is your view that lying to the FBI is a serious crime?
Absolutely.
And both should be investigated vigorously if there's evidence that they occurred?
Yes.
To your knowledge, is there evidence that there has been perjury or obstruction of justice in connection with the investigation into Russian interference in our elections 2016?
I don't have knowledge to that effect, Senator, but I think Special Counsel Mueller would have jurisdiction over that.
And the reason that he's investigating is because there is sufficient evidence to warrant a special counsel, as I advocated at the very beginning of Rod Rosenstein's appointment, and ultimately he agreed to do. So I view this investigation with the utmost seriousness because it does involve obstruction of justice and perjury and potential defrauding the government of its lawful services, conspiracy to violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and other violations of law. And you and I have talked about the need for the FBI to be as independent and immune from political interference as possible, because I foresee a firestorm brewing that will threaten the FBI. And I'm going to support you because I do believe that you will provide the kind of independence and integrity that the FBI needs based on your record and your experience and expertise. And I am trusting, as I think members of this body will, trust you to take that most solemn and historically significant obligation as seriously as you do the crimes of perjury and obstruction of justice. Those kinds of crimes betray the rule of law because they impede vigorous and independent investigation. And we will be counting on you to protect the FBI, which is an institution of such professional excellence and integrity that it is worth any person's career to defend. I hope you agree.
I do agree, Senator.
If you foresee a threat to that independence and integrity that rises to the level of political interference, will you commit to taking appropriate action, which may include resigning from office?
Yes, Senator. As we discussed when we met, one of the lessons I got from both former Attorney General Griffin Bell and former Deputy Attorney General Larry Thompson is that you cannot take on a position like this without resolving in advance that you have to be willing to quit or be fired at a moment's notice in order to stand up for what you think is right. And that would be my commitment to stand firm to that maxim.
And you also told me that you try to persuade whoever might be taking an inappropriate or illegal action, whether it's the President of the United States or anyone else, endeavor to persuade that official to change course, correct?
That's correct, Senator. My whole career, both public and private, has consisted of an awful lot of times telling people things they don't want to hear and talking people out of bad ideas.
In my view, the firing of your predecessor warrants investigation as a potential obstruction of justice. We have not yet proof beyond a reasonable doubt. We have nothing like it, and we're short of evidence necessary to charge anyone. But if that kind of crime has been committed, you would investigate it seriously and diligently, correct?
Well, as to the particular investigation, Special Counsel Mueller is conducting that investigation, and I would view the FBI's role as providing whatever appropriate support is needed so that he can do a thorough investigation. If it were to occur in some other context, then absolutely the FBI, I think, and I take obstruction of justice, perjury, false statements, offenses like that definitely seriously because they go to the integrity of the process. And as I said, I think in response to questions from some of your colleagues like Senator Klobuchar, that it's the integrity of the process is what gives the American people confidence that the outcome of the investigation is the right one.
And you're a partner in that investigation, and I believe that you told me when we met privately that you would provide whatever resources are needed by Bob Mueller to do that investigation.
I would provide all appropriate resources to him. My experience with Director Mueller when we worked together before was always terrific, and I feel confident that he would be professional and only make appropriate requests.
Will you commit to report to this committee any attempts to deny him and that investigation resources or other support that are needed by others in the administration?
Senator, if there was an inappropriate request to deny him appropriate resources, I would try to evaluate the circumstances and take all appropriate action.
Will you be making records of your conversations as Jim Comey did? As you recall, Director Comey contemporaneously made memoranda to reflect his conversations with the President and others. Would you do the same?
I think it would depend on the situation, Senator. I can commit that I would be listening very intently to any conversation I had with anybody of consequence. To me, that's the most important thing. If a conversation that I had suggested to me that I ought to create some record, I wouldn't hesitate to do it, and I've done that before at various stages of my private practice, for example. But I would evaluate each situation on its own merit and circumstances.
A conversation with the President of the United States probably would be a significant conversation, correct?
Well, it depends on what the conversation would be about. I mean, I think if the President said, how's your family? Are they doing? I mean, I'm not sure I would create a record of something like that.
Correct. But if he said, I want a pledge of loyalty from you, Christopher Wray, that would be significant.
I would consider that significant. As I said to some of your colleagues, I was not asked to take any kind of loyalty oath, and I would have refused to take any kind of loyalty.
And I heard your testimony about that in the past, and I respect and believe that you're being truthful in that regard. But going into the future, I take it that if he asks for pledge of loyalty or asks you to shut down an investigation or go lightly on someone, that would be a conversation worth recording, and in fact worth reporting to this committee, I hope.
Well, I would So I would, a conversation like that is something that I would take very seriously and want to make sure that all the right people knew.
Let me ask one last question on this line. You've been asked about the emails from Donald Trump Jr. that have been in public light recently. In your view, as a former prosecutor, could those emails, under some circumstances, be evidence of criminal intent?
Senator, as I think I might have said to one of your colleagues, I actually haven't read the emails. I haven't even had a chance to read any of the newspaper coverage about the emails because it's all happened while I was going up and down from one Senate building to another, meeting with all of your colleagues. So I'm really not up to speed on it, so I can't responsibly answer that question.
Let me switch to a different topic. You've mentioned the scourge of gun violence in this country. Would you support common sense measures to stop gun violence? As you know, I have championed a number of them, along with others on this committee and in the Senate, including universal background checks. Would you support that kind of measure?
Well, I would want to take a look at any specific legislative proposal and get back to you once I had evaluated any specific piece of legislation. But I do support efforts to deal with gun violence aggressively and effectively. And I think my record, both as a line prosecutor and in the leadership of the department, is consistent with that.
In principle, you would support such measures. You'd want to see the details. But, for example, on universal background checks, you would not rule out supporting a measure.
I wouldn't rule out any common sense gun reform legislation without having a chance to review it. I would have to review it and make an assessment based on the circumstances. But I can commit to you that being tough on gun violence is something that I would want to be as director of the FBI.
And one last question. Between 1977 and 2015, there have been hundreds of crimes committed against reproductive health care facilities, clinics, and other offices, abortion providers, reproductive health care centers, including 11 murders, 26 attempted murders, 42 bombings, 185 arsons, and so forth. In 1998, Attorney General Janet Reno created the National Task Force on Violence Against Reproductive Health Providers to coordinate investigation and prosecution of such incidents. As FBI director, I hope you will continue to support the FBI's participation in that effort.
Well, Senator, I gather there's a specific statute that's in place that the FBI has investigative jurisdiction to enforce, and we would zealously investigate all criminal violations, including the ones under that statute.
There are criminal statutes, and I appreciate your commitment. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Hirono, finally.
I feel like you've saved the best for last or something like that. Thank you very much for your patience, and it's good to see you again. I certainly strongly support Ranking Member Feinstein's efforts to work with Chairman Grassley to assert the committee's jurisdiction over the investigation into Russia's interference with our election. And in light of recent news, it is even more important that we hear from Attorney General Sessions and others to get a public accounting. And this committee has an important role to play, as I think you have acknowledged, to ensure that law enforcement investigations are done independently and free from political influence. So clearly, there's been a lot of emphasis and concern on the part of this committee in light of why this vacancy for the FBI director occurred, on the independence of the FBI and you, should you be confirmed, of any political influences. So I do want to return to some questions about Russia's interference with our elections and the continuing position of the president to take seriously the damage to our country or even accept the conclusions of our intel communities. And you have testified that you accept the conclusions of our intel community that Russia did attempt to interfere with our elections.
As I said, Senator, I've only been able to review the public summary, but I have no reason to doubt the conclusions of the intelligence community. And probably
the non-public portions would be even more confirming the public information as to Russia's attempts to interfere with our elections. So there's also been testimony not only by former Director Comey, but others in the intel community that we can expect Russia to continue to interfere with our elections. So should you be confirmed, what would you do to prevent this kind of interference?
Well, I would want to get briefed by the appropriate professionals, both at the FBI and in other parts of the intelligence community, on what we know about how any nation state, whether it's Russia or any other nation state, is attempting to or has attempted to interfere. What are we doing to detect it? How can we be confident that we're taking all the right steps? Are there sources of information that we're not getting that we need to get access to? So I would need to get briefed up on all those efforts.
In my meeting with you, you made it very clear that any foreign country's attempts to interfere, a particular one that is an adversary to us, a foreign country's attempts to interfere with our election is an attack on some very, very basic premises of our country, our democracy. So you would take this kind of conclusion that Russia will continue to interfere as very serious, and that it would be a priority
Very
for the
seriously
FBI.
indeed, Senator.
Okay. There were a number of one-on-one conversations that I would characterize as improper or questionable one-on-one meetings that FBI Director Comey had with President Trump, and you've testified to the concerns that you would have, and you said a number of times that should that kind of circumstance occur between you and President Trump, that you would go to Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, not to the Attorney General Sessions. You've said that a number of times during your testimony today. Why would you not go to AG Sessions?
Well, I wouldn't, unless there was something that the Attorney General was recused from, I wouldn't rule out talking to the Attorney General as well. But the department's organizational chart, the FBI reports to the Deputy Attorney General, number one. And number two, contacts, the policy that the department has that governs contacts between the White House and the Justice Department directs that those kinds of contacts should occur through the office of the Deputy Attorney General. So that strikes me as the appropriate place to start in those conversations.
And of course, in this instance, Attorney General Sessions has recused himself from pretty much anything relating to the Russia investigations, correct?
That's my understanding, but I'm not familiar with the full scope of the recusal.
And yet, on the other hand, when Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein sent his memo regarding Director Comey, there was a letter attached from Jeff Sessions that recommended to the president that Comey be fired. Would you consider that appropriate for someone who recused himself from these matters?
Well, Senator, I don't know all the circumstances surrounding Director Comey's firing, and I know that Special Counsel Mueller is, I believe, investigating that, so it's probably not responsible for me to speculate. I will say that the Attorney General of the United States has authority over the Justice Department, which covers much more than any single investigation. And clearly, the Attorney General needs to be able to make decisions that affect the whole institution. Obviously, if he's recused, he can't participate in a particular investigation.
Well, I would say that the firing of Director Comey was part and parcel, as it turns out, of the elections, and that was a circumstance that Attorney General Sessions was supposed to recuse himself from. Now, the Attorney General does get briefings on FBI investigations, ongoing FBI investigations. Is that correct?
That's historically been the case.
So in a case where the Attorney General has recused himself, should he be getting briefings on Mr. Mueller's investigations?
If I understand your question correctly, Senator, anyone who has recused himself from an investigation, whether it's Attorney General or anyone else, shouldn't be getting briefed on that investigation,
Yes.
that specific investigation.
Yes.
No.
So the answer would be no, that he should not be getting briefings on the Mueller investigations.
And I have no reason to believe that he is.
Okay. I think when you were first asked whether you had met with President Trump regarding your nomination, and you said no, but then later you said that you were first contacted about this nomination from with Deputy Director Rosenstein, and then you had a subsequent meeting with Jeff Sessions and Rosenstein, and then you had another meeting at the White House where the president attended. So when you had your initial meeting with Deputy AG Rosenstein, did the subject of Comey's firing, did the subject of the Mueller investigation come up? Did you go in with any kind of seeking of reassurances that should you take this position, you would be free to do your job free from political pressure?
I did go into my meeting with Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein and Attorney General Sessions. I met with them together with a number of questions and in my mind about wanting to be sure that I knew what I was getting myself into, and was very comfortable with what I heard.
What was it
there was
that
not
you heard?
there was not a discussion of Comey's firing or of the Russia investigation other than Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein making a comment to the effect that now that Special Counsel Mueller has been appointed, that situation is more straightforward because there's an investigation going and Special Counsel Mueller has that. So from my perspective, the landscape that I was coming into at that point was different than it would have been without Special Counsel Mueller having been appointed.
So did you come to a conclusion that you would not probably be having one-on-one discussions about the Russian interference with the president as had occurred with Director Comey because you had Mueller there conducting an investigation?
Yes.
Okay. So that you were assured or reassured that you would be able to do your job?
I was very comfortable that I would be able to do my job after that meeting, yes.
At the time that you had a meeting with Jeff Sessions and Deputy Director Rosenstein, did you indicate to them that should you get the job that you would very much support the Mueller investigation?
I did not discuss the Russia investigation with them. As I said, other than Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein making the comment that that was now in place, which would make it easier for me to do my job. That was the sum total of that. What I did say to them is I would approach, much as I've said to this committee, the way I would approach this job is with independence, straight, and by the book.
So considering that the president was very focused on the Russian investigation, and basically I think his position is that he hoped that it would go away. When you met with people at the White House, and I'm not sure exactly who was there, but the president was there, did the question of the Mueller investigation come up or the Russian investigation come up at all?
No, not at all, Senator.
Did you think that was odd? Was it just a hello, good to see you kind of a meeting that you had at the White House?
I mean, I would describe it as a pleasant conversation. I did not think it was odd that the president nor anybody else didn't raise with me the conduct of a specific investigation because I would not have expected them to do that.
I know that I'm running out of time, so I would want to get into a second round, so thank you very much.
People do want a second round.
Yes.
And in fact, I'm going to start the second round right now. I think we have at least one Republican that hasn't had the first round. But,
Oh, so thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll
but
wait
you
for my
will have
second
another
round.
opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah. I want to ask you about Section 702, provides government the authority to collect electronic communications of foreigners located outside of the United States with the assistance of the American Electronic Communication Services providers. It's an authority used only for counterterrorism, but counterintelligence purposes as well. This is an authority that the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, and I won't finish this paragraph, but a lot of people say it's very essential. So I go to you as FBI Director-to-be. One of your key responsibilities will be overseeing investigations of threats to national security. Your predecessor repeatedly affirmed his support for the value of 702 as a national security tool. So just in a very general way, could you tell us whether reauthorization of Section 702 will remain important to the FBI under your leadership, and also whether the FBI under your leadership will make sure that it uses this national security authority with proper training, execution, oversight to comply with the law and protect the Fourth Amendment rights.
Well, Senator, it's been a number of years since I had anything to do with FISA, although I did deal with it a certain amount when I was in the government before. And of course, Section 702 was passed after I had left government. But from everything I understand, from the public comments of people in the intelligence community, 702 is a vital tool and one that we need to put a high priority, and that I would expect to place a high priority on seeking reauthorization on. My understanding as to the second part of your question is that there are a number of oversight mechanisms built into the statutory framework, both in the executive branch, multiple levels of oversight, in the legislative branch, and the court, the FISA court itself, and I think that's appropriate, and I would look for ways to ensure that the tool was used appropriately.
Okay. I want to talk about leaks. The FBI has often failed to answer this committee's questions, but then the same information gets leaked to the media or produced in the Freedom of Information Act litigation. Is it appropriate for the FBI to ignore requests from this committee and provide the same information to the media in a third-party litigation? If not, what will you do to ensure that this committee's request will receive? And I asked the same question of Comey in oversight hearings, his last oversight here a couple weeks before he left the directorship. And I said, how do you justify Citizen Grassley using FOIA information, getting more information than Senator Grassley can get? And he says, I can't tell you why. And I said, ye gods, you can't. A senator can't get as much information as a private citizen can get. And often the letters that we send for information, we read about FOIA getting it, and we read about it in the newspaper before we get an answer to our letters.
Well, Senator, as we discussed in our meeting in your office, I think it's obviously important for the FBI, working with the department's help and approval, to be as responsive as possible to this committee and especially, of course, to its chairman. I'm not familiar with the particular circumstances surrounding FOIA productions of any of these materials. I agree with you that that strikes me, just listening to you describe it, as an odd situation, to put it mildly.
Yeah. I don't expect you to respond to this next question with anything about Mr. McCabe, but I use Mr. McCabe as an example. As I noted in my opening statement, the department refused to provide an unredacted copy of Mr. McCabe's recusal memo, and the Deputy Attorney General has failed to explain to this committee what he's doing to deal with the conflict of interest. In a general matter, do you think it is appropriate for any FBI official to participate in a criminal investigation of someone who is an adverse witness in a pending EEO proceeding? And if not, what would you do if confirmed to assure that that does not happen on your watch?
Well, Senator, Mr. Chairman, obviously I want to make sure that I understand the facts appropriately. I think that one of the first things I would do upon being confirmed is to try to take stock of the situation with the senior leadership and try to understand better the circumstances. There is, of course, Inspector General investigation into Acting Director McCabe's conduct, and I know, Mr. Chairman, your own strong support for the Inspector General function is well known, and I obviously would want to respect that and not comment here out of school.
Okay, I'm going to put some letters in the record again of support for you from various law enforcement organizations, and they support your appointment, and it's law enforcement community at large and support it strongly. FBI Agents Association, Atlantic Division, Society of Former Special Agents of FBI, National Fraternal Order of Police, the National Association of Police Organizations, International Association of Chiefs of Police, Major County Sheriffs of America, the Association of State Criminal Investigative Agencies, and the National Narcotic Officers Association Coalition and the National Fusion Center Association all be entered into the record without objection. They will be. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Looks like we're nearing an end here. But I did want to mention not just the letter of support that Senator Grassley just mentioned, but also the earlier one had former U.S. attorneys and from all over the country supporting you. I thought that was very impressive, and it included our former Republican-appointed U.S. attorney in Minnesota, as well as our recent Democratic-appointed attorney in Minnesota. So I want to commend you for that. Just a few follow-up questions. The first is opioids. I don't know that that has come up, and it's an epidemic would be a mild way of phrasing what's going on. In my state, we've lost everyone from superstar like Prince to swimming star from our high school swimming team. We've actually had more people die from opioid overdoses in Minnesota than we have from homicide or than we have from car crashes. And you and I talked earlier about the bills that I have to make it easier to go after some of the synthetic drugs from a law enforcement standpoint. And then also, of course, the work that we have done, Senator Whitehouse, Portman, and others, and myself have done in leading the bill to set a national framework, but now it's time to implement it. And it's everything from treatment to better sharing the data across state lines so that we can monitor prescriptions and share that data. And I just wondered from an FBI perspective if you could give any views you have on this epidemic.
Well, Senator, I strongly agree that it's a major, major problem that's not only sweeping this country, but seems to be getting worse all the time in a lot of states, and it sounds like including in Minnesota. I think that an awful lot of the effort in this area from a federal law enforcement perspective would probably come from the Drug Enforcement Administration, but I do think the FBI should look for ways to partner with other federal agencies and state and local law enforcement to figure out how it can contribute what it can uniquely contribute to a multidisciplinary assault on the problem.
As you know, sex trafficking and human trafficking as a whole has been very important to me. Senator Cornyn and I passed the bill that sets out a federal effort, and both the former attorney generals as well as Deputy Attorney General Yates, who has actually worked on these cases, I know, in Atlanta, have been involved in this. And the FBI has been an important part of the efforts to end trafficking with the Innocence Lost National Initiative that began in 2003. One part of this program, Operation Cross Country, which focuses on underage victims, was successful in rescuing 82 children and arresting 239 traffickers during its last cycle, ending last October. I understand this has been an important issue for you, and you've done some pro bono work to help trafficking victims. Can you tell us more about your work and how you intend to carry this out if you are come into the directorship?
Thank you, Senator. As we discussed, this is an issue that you and I both feel very passionately about. When I was in the criminal division, one of the things that we did towards the end of my tenure was recognizing the increase in human trafficking and the multidisciplinary, again, I use that word, nature of the problem. We're bringing together both sort of the child exploitation side of it, there's an immigration side of it, an alien smuggling side of it, there's an organized gang activity side of it, there is, in response to questions that you asked earlier in a different context, there's a financial side of it, and so I think it needs to be a sort of coordinated effort. It's an incredibly vulnerable population that has subject to enormous leverage by the bad guys. And one of the, as you mentioned, one of the pro bono things that I'm most pleased of, and I'm looking forward to hearing my firm take to the next level after I've left, is an effort focused on helping human trafficking victims who don't get really any serious help in our system. And I was really excited to see the young lawyers in our firm kind of get fired up to go see how they can be helpful. It's a different kind of pro bono work than I think a lot of firms do, and I think it's a great thing.
Thank you.
Senator Klobuchar is going to shut down this meeting after Senator Hirono's done, unless somebody on my side comes. So I'm going to go do a news conference, not about you, but just a general one, and that I do every day or every Wednesday at 2 o'clock. So I want to congratulate you. And as I said originally, I think I said, we expect to move this along and get this position filled very quickly. And I think your testimony today helps us do that. And I want to compliment your family and your friends for being here with you. And thank Senator Klobuchar. Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Getting back to the meeting that you had at the White House regarding your nomination, President Trump was there. Can you tell us who else was there from the administration?
I had 2 meetings. The first was the President, the Vice President, the White House counsel, and then a couple people from the Justice Department. The second meeting was the President, the President's Chief of Staff, the White House counsel, and again, some people from the department, including Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein.
When was the first meeting? Do you recall?
The first meeting was the day after Memorial Day. It was publicly reported, as I understand it.
And at neither one of these meetings did the issue of the Russia investigation, Mueller, or the Comey firing came up.
Correct.
So what did the president say to you in the first meeting, and what did he say to you in the second meeting?
Both meetings, Senator, were very conversational about my bio, my background. I talked about my commitment in the war on terror, my experiences from having been in the department before. It was more of a, I would describe it as more of a kind of get to know you kind of conversation in both instances.
And knowing how strongly you believe that the FBI should be free to investigate, free from political influence, et cetera, at that time, did you express any of that kind of a strong commitment to the independence of the FBI at either one of these 2 meetings to anybody at these meetings?
In the White House meeting?
Yes.
I may have at some point repeated the line that I told you a few minutes ago about my commitment to playing it straight. Mm-hmm. You know, that's my approach, or words to that effect, but it wasn't really in context called for. I would say, Senator, that I went into both meetings listening very carefully to make sure that I didn't hear something that would make me uncomfortable. Having gotten a high level of confidence in both Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, who I've known since 2001, and Attorney General Sessions in that meeting that I had, I was then focused more in the White House meetings on making sure that I didn't hear something that I would consider problematic. And I can assure you that if anything had been said that made me remotely uncomfortable, I would not be sitting here today providing testimony in support of my nomination.
So definitely things like an expectation of loyalty to the president, that would have been a red flag for you.
I was not asked to take any kind of loyalty oath.
But that would have been the kind of thing that you would have been highly sensitive to listen for, and that didn't
Correct.
happen.
That did not happen.
Let me turn to, we have an administration that has talked about a Muslim registry, Muslim registry, for example. Would you go along with something like that? Talked about, surveilling mosques, creating a Muslim registry. As FBI director, would you go along with such a scheme?
Well, Senator, I don't know enough about the specific proposals or plans that anybody's talking about. I would say that my commitment on these issues would be the same as it would be on anything else, which is faithful to the law, faithful to the Constitution, and faithful to the best practices of the FBI and the department. And as I said, I think in response to Senator Durbin, my experience with terrorism matters is that we need the cooperation of the Muslim American community. and that a lot of the leads in some of the most important investigations that law enforcement has obtained have been from those people. And so I think the FBI director needs to be an FBI director for all Americans.
So any kind of a program that would single out individuals based on their religion would raise some concerns for you, that you would ask some but quite specific questions, I would say, right? Because it's a foundational, religious freedom, not racial profiling. Are those areas that, as FBI director, you would be particularly sensitive about moving forward on any kind of programs that would treat different groups, particularly minority groups, in any kind of a discriminatory way?
Well, Senator, needless to say, discrimination is abhorrent and not something that I would condone. I would want to pay particularly close attention to any program that seemed to raise those kinds of concerns. And as I mentioned, on the issue of religious freedom, which is something that's always been very important to me, and one of the, as I said, one of the cases that was one of the more meaningful cases I ever did as a line prosecutor was a case where churches all around the country were being burned down precisely because of hostility to a particular religion, which is obviously unacceptable.
Hate to interrupt, but I seem to be over my time. I know that if you don't mind, Madam Chair, your firm has represented various individuals who have interest to the Russian energy interests, et cetera, and so I will submit a question as to whether any investigations that would involve clients of what would probably be your former law firm, should you take this position, how you would handle any conflict issues regarding those kinds of circumstances. And then I'll also submit some questions relating to hate crimes, because as we mentioned in my meeting with you, that there is a rise in hate crimes and what the FBI can do and should do to counter and prevent hate crimes. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ray, Senator Durbin is going to join us, so now you and I are going to be engaged in a little filibuster. I have, and he's here. I have some follow-up questions. While he's sitting down, I did want to, this question I asked you really quickly about the shell companies and the use of shell companies. I just want to explain it, and you answered it fine, but it's a very big deal to me because the Treasury Department has noted a significant rise in the use of shell companies in real estate transactions because foreign buyers use them as a way to hide their identity and safely conceal money in the U.S. It could be from any country. I used it in the context of Russia. I raised this with Director Comey when he testified last time, and just about and your experience with white-collar cases. Does the anonymity associated with the use of shell companies to buy real estate hurt the FBI's ability to trace the flow of illicit money and fight organized crime?
Certainly, Senator, those kinds of maneuvers, the creation of shell companies and things like that, are unfortunately an all too common way that criminals and others try to circumvent detection. And so certainly I would think that the FBI needs to work with its partners in law enforcement, especially the Treasury Department, to, as I said, follow the money. And sometimes that's easier said than done, but I think that's a critical step to trying to prevent and disrupt and not just detect after the fact criminal conduct.
Thank you very much. Senator Durbin.
Thank you. I know this has been a long ordeal for you, but I think it's coming to an end. Let me just try to ask 2 or 3 questions and to nail down this torture memo issue. I want to follow up on what you said earlier about your role in approval of interrogation techniques, which we also discussed in my office. You said that during your time in the Deputy Attorney General's office, you don't recall reviewing or commenting on any memo written by John Yoo. You also said that as Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division, you, quote, provided general information and legal support, close quote, regarding the legal standards for interrogation. I want to ask you about one specific memo, and I'm going to send it down to you if you haven't had a chance to see it, because I want you to. It was written by Daniel Levin, and it was dated December 2004. This memo replaced the August 2002 Bybee memo, and it says that the Criminal Division reviewed and approved it. It specifically says it. The Criminal Division of the Department of Justice has reviewed this memorandum and concurs in the analysis set forth below. Here's the key point. In a footnote on the memo indicates that under the new analysis, all of the torture techniques that were approved under the Bybee memo, like waterboarding, would still be legal under the new memo. In other words, nothing changed. And it says that expressly had the approval of your division. Do you recall reviewing and approving that memo?
I do not recall reviewing and approving that memo, but what I do recall is that we we drew a line about what the criminal division's appropriate role was, that the criminal division should be consulted on the general meaning of the statute, what the elements are, how you define what the elements are. What I did not think was the appropriate role for the criminal division, and so we did not review and approve or bless, is review of particular interrogation techniques. And that was because, even at the time, I believe, we were already starting to investigate, and in one case which led ultimately to prosecution, cases where techniques went too far. And I did not think it was appropriate for the criminal division to be setting interrogation policy or providing legal advice on a going forward basis.
The memo does not make that distinction. It simply says, the criminal division of the Department of Justice has reviewed this memo and concurs in the analysis set forth below, which goes into detail in terms of techniques, interrogation techniques, in the footnotes. Well, I want to give this to you because I want you to take a look at it. I'm not trying to stump you here. Take a look at it and see if you can put it in context for me. Tell me if I'm missing something about this. But it appears that this did go through your division, and I want to hear, after you've had a chance to look at it, if you wouldn't mind, if you would respond and let me know that.
Okay.
Is that fair? Two other things. You worked with U.S. Attorney Chris Christie.
When I was Assistant Attorney General, yes, he was the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey.
And you were part of the Bristol-Myers Squibb settlement, involved in it?
That I don't think so. I was aware of the Bristol-Myers investigation. I think it's possible that the settlement may have occurred after I had left the criminal division.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. The last point I want to ask you about relates to the obstruction of justice, which I think you've, in a 2004 speech about prosecuting corporate fraud, you urged severe penalties for obstruction of justice, and you said, quote, lying to government investigators, obstructing our investigation needs to be seen as one of the surest paths to severe consequences, end of quote. Do you believe that obstruction of justice by government officials should be treated similarly?
I think obstruction of justice, whether it's committed by a senior corporate executive or a guy in the mailroom or a government official, needs to be treated very seriously.
In the early Enron cases that you were involved in, they are exceptional in that people went to jail. Executives went to jail. And then we kind of, some reason or another, the Department of Justice lost its stomach for that and stopped sending people to jail. To me, that is a category of injustice, which I hope we will rectify. I don't have great hope, but I hope we will rectify in the future if there's wrongdoing that harms so many people. Would you comment on that particular aspect of prosecution?
Happy to, Senator. I feel very strongly that when one is investigating companies, that we need to look at the people, the individuals in the company who may have engaged in wrongdoing, because companies act through people. And so I think one of the things that we did effectively with the Enron task force and in a number of other corporate fraud prosecutions during that era was show that we were willing to follow the facts and the law wherever they may lead, all the way to the very top of the house. And in the Enron case in particular, as you know, as you commented on, we brought cases against essentially the entire C-suite of the company. Obviously, we have to have the facts and the evidence and the law to support it. We can't succumb to mob rule or anything like that, but I think we need to be sure, and I think that is the way I view the FBI's mission, is to follow the facts and the law wherever they may lead, to whomever they may lead, even if people don't like it.
That's fair. Thanks for your patience today, and I'm going to send this memo down to you so you have a chance to take it with you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ray. I think you can finally get some lunch here. I wanted to thank you and to make sure you know that you have a lot of support here. I am going to be supporting you, as a number of my colleagues are. I think your answers earlier explaining your opposition to torture of any kind was very important when Senator Feinstein asked you those questions. I also think that the answers that you gave to many of the senators about the independence of the FBI was very compelling and heartfelt, and that meant a lot, because I don't have to tell you that you're coming in at a time that is unprecedented, where you've had the director of the FBI fired, the then acting attorney general a few months ago fired. And as someone that's been in law enforcement and believes that law enforcement has to have people that are in charge, that follow the law and care about the law and believe in our democracy more than anything, it couldn't be a more important time for you to be coming into this agency. And I think that you saw the bipartisan nature of the questions, and the respect here has a lot to do with how you've handled it and your experience today, but it also has a lot to do because the senators here know how important this job is right now. So I want to thank you for your time. And we are going to leave the record open until Friday if senators have further questions. And I'm pleased to say this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.